So welcoming all of you. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so excited to be with you guys. I think I've said that 3 times, but now we're recording, so I get to say it again. And I'm beaming in from Kipahulu, Maui today, and I get to speak with the one and the only Samantha Sweetwater. I've known Samantha. I think I met Samantha first through osmosis. I met her through her reputation and through her juicy aliveness of what she brings I mean, I think it first started as the dance movement thematic community, but it's gone so beyond that. And it's been such a fun thing to get to watch your evolution as a woman, as a teacher, as a healer, as a pioneer in the realm of so many different things around consciousness, connected to the earth, connected to the land, connected to the past, connected to the future. I love the way this woman works with words. I'm going to read you her bio. I don't like reading people's bios, I got to say. It's not normally all that entertaining, but I will say that the way that Samantha enjoys working with language is so gorgeous that I want to bring it to you. And I'm in Kipahulu, and everything moves slower here, including my internet. Okay, so Samantha is a Gaian futurist. Isn't that a fantastic term? She's a Gaian futurist, executive coach, ceremonial guide, and bioregionalist, caring for people and the earth at the intersection of personal transformation and civilization transition. I love the use of her language. She teaches a systematic and embodied approach to deconstructing separation, healing trauma, and reawakening to nature, the body, and the soul to remember wholeness, revitalize kinship, and activate purposeful leadership for all life. Don't you all want to take a class with Samantha on how to write your own bio? It's just so gorgeous. And she's the founder of One Life Circle, a plant medicine ministry dedicated to the emergence of a culture of homecoming through soul realization and the restoration of intimacy with and belonging to life. She advises leaders and companies in the areas of technology, health, material economy, and psychedelics. And she's the former founder of Dancing Freedom and the Peace Body Japan, where she pioneered the conscious dance movement. And the bio goes on, but we're going to stop right now and get to hear just from your beautiful voice. Hello, hello. I'm going
Hey.
to ask you a funny question. It's about essence.
Mm.
If you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be?
On some days I would be a redwood, some days I'd be a bishop pine, and some days I would be like an aspen,
Great.
but not all at the same time. And I love sycamores, but I don't think I am a sycamore.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's in your you get to hang out with sycamores, but you're not one.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm gonna sit with that one.
Yeah, it's funny because I love playing at the archetypes, and there's this piece around dragons and fairies. Like I love hanging out with fairies, but I'm not one. I'm more dragon, more mermaid, and it's like really fun when you get to know what the archetype is, and you're like, I can't be a sycamore and I can't be a fairy, but I like hanging out with them.
Hmm.
Um,
I'm definitely a wood elf.
yes, you are. So I want to know, I mean, we've gotten to circle around each other. We've gotten to go to Burning Man together. I've seen you in so many different aspects of life. And I don't know that I've gotten to like sit down and hear the story of your journey, in
Mm.
terms of how did you step onto this path? Like, how did you know that embodiment, dancing, like you were such a leader in that space. I don't know that there was anyone to follow. Like, how did you make your way? What's your origin story?
You know, I've struggled with my origin story because it doesn't have, I live in awakening communities and people always ask, what was your awakening? And I'm like, well, I think my story is really defined by from being very young age, kind of an early indigo. I don't know if that's meaningful to everyone on the call, but it's a way of describing someone like a way shower, like someone who came in with with a strong sense of the world as humans are doing it is not the world that I know to be true.
Mm.
And meaning there is an obvious harmony that is emanating from nature and the planet and even the human collective psyche and soul that I don't see reflected by the way people are doing humanness. And I had a really early strong sense of that. I also have always had an incredibly strong sense of the divinity of nature. I
Mhm.
didn't I didn't call it that, and I don't think you need to call anything divine to experience it as divine. Like, I think the space between awe, wonder, and divinity is almost non-existent, and we get very confused trying to parse that about whether that's sacred or secular or scientific or spiritual. It's like it's all the same witnessing of divinity to me. And I've always had that. And yeah, I was raised very much with science and art and nature as my teachers, and was a really geeky kid, was kind of identified as a child prodigy. And at 14, I found dance, and dance was an antidote to my own mind. And it was also a way to, like, I already had a really strong sense for the way that um depending on what epistemic framework we take on a thing, we end up with different data and different answers. And yet there's a kind of like subjective truth that can be shared with other people in breath and tears and embodiment and movement that has a quality of truth that doesn't need to be named, that is transmissible, that is that builds community, that builds shared feeling. And it was really clear to me from very young that there was a quality of depth and truth and possibility and healing and truth in that direction that couldn't be found in any other directions. Like I love science, but I think if we're honest about what happens with when we make something objective, we're also collapsing huge ways of knowing about it. I mean, I imagine that has a lot to
Right.
do with
The
why
whole
you do
idea of
story.
if you answer the question, you killed the question. So I love that way of allowing that kind of space to wonder. I want to hear about like a specific moment in your life that like where I mean I really appreciate you saying that it's so easy. I mean, you're such a pervasive deep thinker and that moment of when you're like, oh, the body, like I need to be in the body.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that early journey was a very primary one of there's just I can make a deeper sense of my life here. I can feel and I can cry and I can make beautiful things and I can go into trance and I can connect with other people and both, drawing people into the creative process and connecting through making things, through choreographing, and then also connecting with audiences in ways that were really deep and really rich. But there's been many moments. I thought I was going to, I had stopped dancing and moved to Australia to a permaculture farm. And I was like, okay, the dance phase is over. I'm going off to do permaculture and community development. This was in my early 30s. And I got to Australia and I started going to the markets on Sundays where there's big dance circles. And I started, when I would dance in those dance circles, dances from all over the world would come through my body, particularly African dances, but like not just kind of making it up, but like having these full forms take over my body. And that was kind of the center of an experience that I had there where I could not make money doing anything other than dancing. Like the land wanted me to dance, the community around me was like, would you start creating classes? Would you do this? Would you do that? I was offered a job at the local conservatory that I hadn't even applied for, that they wanted. Like it was everything in the land there wanted me to dance. And there's a thing if you're connected to the stories and the intelligence that land holds, where land, like the land in Africa never forgot it, or excuse me, in Australia never forgot itself. Like it's only had a couple generations of colonization on top of the song lines, and the people have been singing the song lines back open. And so that land never forgot itself. And it was like a Gaian commandment, like thou shalt dance. And so that was one experience that was pretty pronounced of that birth dancing freedom, which is why you know me. You know me because of a thing that I built that in a lot of ways I would say Australia, Gaia pushed me to do.
You know, you're making me think of a book by Martha Graham called Blood Memory. And she
Mhm.
talked about this moment, I believe, when she went to Egypt and she all of a sudden just started dancing their traditional dances. And they were all like, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I don't know. I just have this blood memory in me." Like, and that's always stayed with me my whole life, hearing that story.
Mhm.
You know, this piece that you're just speaking to also that feels really resonant is what a gift it is to be seen and recognized for your gift and have it be called out. You know, I feel like that's a really, you know, it speaks something to the culture of Australia, the culture of the community that you were in, where they were like that more, you know, and I feel like when we're part of those kinds of communities, when people are looking at us and looking for us, not just comparing, but
Mhm.
really looking for what do we have to give? What do we have to offer? And how much richer we all are when we call that out of each other, you know.
Yes.
Um, I mean, like, I don't like, where do we begin? When we were talking about, uh, topics for today, and how do we connect this idea of story to our ancestry? Like, how do we come to the place where we can express our essence? What's the work? Where do you begin in terms of this idea of, I love this phrase that you said, that we can't grow what did you say? We can't grow a story on top. How do we grow a story on top of where we came from?
We
You said,
can't grow wholeness on top of brokenness. We can't grow a story of wholeness on top of unresolved. What I was saying is that there's unresolved content that carries stories that we're not aware of. And if we don't go into that content, we will just project, we project whatever story we're carrying. But there's like all kinds of unresolved content underneath it.
can you give an
Um,
example of someone that you're working with or your own work where you've had to go into those old stories to
I mean,
arrive?
I think I right now most centrally archetypally poignant for me is like all kinds of things trigger a sense of carrying blood memories of patriarchal rupture. And and then I'll watch how I play that out in terms of power dynamics with men in who I'm in leadership positions with. Um, of and when I say patriarchy, I could say this another way. I think I'm still unearthing ways in which I'm carrying the witch burnings. I'm carrying the ways in which Judeo-Christianity, specifically patriarchy generally, has annihilated people who care for the earth, people who speak for the goddess, people who are midwives, know how to tend the seeds, know how to birth babies, are erotic stewards, and are stewards of the body and eros and all of these things, are stewards of medicine, and I carry medicine. And there's some very, very deep, but almost at the surface all the time, unconscious aspect of me that is just like waiting to be violated.
Mm.
And like tracks what I think of as microaggressions, like the more work I do around anti-racism and being a good ally, it's all the same structure of trauma where my system looks for microaggressions against connection with the feminine, connection with the body, connection with the earth, respect for seasons and cycles, respect for the sentience of animals. It's like I live with that at such a deep truth, but then I'm also living with the story of the unresolved content of rupture. So it's an interesting thing to like, when you're ready, when I'm ready, like go into that content. And I've gone into it many, many times, but I'm also forced to recognize I haven't finished the work.
Mhm. And there's, you know, from a storied place, I'm hearing, you know, a couple of different things where like there are these old stories, you know, where um, you know, I laugh, don't laugh, but you know, being Jewish, like I have to have a full cupboard of food. My fridge has to be full. You know, somewhere in my genealogy, somebody starved, you know, and it's like it's just part of my lived experience. You know,
Yeah.
it's like a history that I'm part of that I don't even know the story, but something in me lives it, you know.
Mhm.
You know, when you were talking about this some part of you is waiting to be violated, you know, and it's like has eyes for that. And you know, one of the things that also made me think about was Femme Inc. They're not in business anymore. It was started by Rachel Payne, but they did all this research on how women are portrayed in media. And just like I don't know, like 78, I have to go find the research. Almost like 78% of the instances showed women being raped, abused, or violated in one way or another. And what that does to our current mindset. You know,
Yeah.
you're talking about past, like, you know, if there's some blood memory in your system where this has happened, it's like it's a known thing. So there's some familiarity, but it's like, but there's also this bombardment
Oh,
of what keeps
completely.
those stories alive is when we keep
Completely.
eating them rather than healing them. And I feel like
Yes.
that's where the magic and the medicine is. And, you know, it's like you mentioned that you're a medicine carrier and, you know, this place of where, you know, these portals that get opened, you know, and we get access to these other places and we get access to our story in another way. I'd love to hear you talk about, you know, the role of story and being a medicine keeper and how do we tend the stories that we receive in those places.
Mm. There's so many angles to that question, and it's so rich. My teacher, George Great Eagle Bertelstein, who passed last year, used to say, and I work primarily with San Pedro. I work with many medicines, and it's important to say this. Different medicines work very differently relative to story,
Mm.
extremely differently. San Pedro isn't a very narrative medicine. It's not to say it can't sometimes be really visionary, but it's actually kind of it's very quieting in a way. So like George used to say, the medicine gives your stories wings,
Mm.
which was a very shorthand way of saying that one of the ways that that medicine works is that you can bring your stories in if you're honest about them, like um, I really struggle with microaggressions towards the feminine writ large and macroaggressions. Like I struggle with what's going on with the Supreme Court. I struggle with what's going on with abortion. I struggle with da 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 da. But specifically, like I witness myself in like hypervigilance, waiting to be cut down. And bring that in. San Pedro specifically works with the feeling content of that story. And so if you can be honest enough about the story that you're carrying, you can often access the emotional content of that story and move it. And the way San Pedro likes to work is it likes to bring that out of you as getting well, which means throwing up, or like strong emotional experience, or like sometimes emotional experience that almost has no, that's strong, like tears, grief, um, joy, and then a very clear prayer. With San Pedro, you work with prayer, as prayer is a kind of programming. You could say prayer is a kind of story that you work with in a way where prayer is kind of like, what's so lovely about prayer is you're saying, I'm not the only one holding this story anymore. I'm going to speak a story. God, I want to feel safe in my body and my life and my femininity. Can you help me with that? And where I'm not safe, can you help me be ferocious and clear and like the energetic of authority that is untriggered? That's a great story about who I want to be. That in the elevation of medicine, what you're doing in a prayer is you're kind of like offering that NLP, right? Like that self-programming in a way that is greater than yourself. You're like handing it to the more than yourself. I think of divinity, God, when we're praying. I think and feel. I don't want to say I just think of God this way. I experience God as the inner indwelling divine, the fabric of everything that is co-generating reality. And you could say like the one, which I think of more as the listening principle that's outside of me. So, you know, a prayer is planting a story in the fabric of all of that, that is both for one to hold for oneself, but also great. You're not in control of holding it. It's such a beautiful thing about prayer and medicine, and specifically like the way that you can work with that as a frequency in San Pedro. Whereas if you were working with that with ayahuasca, you would go in with an intention, like, I really want to work the content around where I am holding ancestral story, ancestral content, ancestral narrative, present tense, collective content that's not mine. And I need help to like see who I really am and like make a very clear story that allows me to know who I am. So, and then the way that works in the medicine can be very discursive. Like ayahuasca often shows you vast pictures or talks to you directly. And so it's a very, very, very different medicine. It's very cool to talk about the medicines in terms of story because they work really differently. Like Iboga works a little like ayahuasca, but it's a very different brain state. And sometimes it's um the pictures that Iboga, someone said you cannot lie to yourself on ayahuasca. It's true. And I would say it's even more true on Iboga. um and the way that that medicine can show you like a narrative, can show you a story. Like, this is the story of who you are with this partner into the future. Ayahuasca can do that too, but the way Iboga does that is very amazing. Like, I saw a picture, I saw the story I have about, I won't say who, but someone I love very deeply. At the core of essence, the image that I was offered was this little acorn becoming this like the planetary Yggdrasil oak of like growing roots and an arbor to cover the whole world. And it's like, when I get lost about who that person is, or when that person gets lost about who that person is, I say, do you remember who Iboga showed me that you are? Do you remember who you are?
And what I love about this and what you're speaking to is that, you know, each of these plants has their own spirit, has their own way. You know, like a person has a way, a dog has a way, a cat has a way, a boga has a way, ayahuasca has a way, San Pedro has a way. And, you know, they're each, you know, from my understanding, they're opening doors. They're opening doors for another way. And then they speak to us through the language that we can understand. And I actually think of story, like when I do story ceremonies, I think of story as the medicine. You know, that the story itself can open the channel where we can see people's essences, where we can see different things. And they're different, each person has a different way of connecting and bringing in, right? But I love this way of also being so intentional with how you meet it, and also this language of prayer. You were talking initially about that moment that you had where you're like, there's a dissonance between, how I understood it, like what we're seeing of the world, what my experience is of the natural world and Gaia and environment. And one of the things I was recently thinking about is that our climate narrative, it's a narrative, not a story, right, about what was happening. And we're pointing people in a direction. We're saying, look here, putting blindfolds. It's not a story, which is a whole thing. And it doesn't have a prayer. There's no prayer in it. And I was like, it was like getting hit against the head, in terms of someone who cares so much about the environment, who uses the power of story to bring us closer, to realize, oh my God, the biggest thing that people are hitting repeat over and over again lacks a prayer and a vision for life. Can you talk a little bit about the technology of prayer? Because I feel like you're in that space so well and are so refined in your language.
Sure. I mean, I think very much of prayer as an intention plus surrender.
Mm.
And it's a beautiful way to think. Story is a beautiful way to think about prayer. I don't usually think about prayer in terms of story, but a prayer it's like offering, it's saying, God, will you weave this story with me?
Mhm.
That's what it's saying. Like, will you weave the story of a beautiful world with me? I want a beautiful world. I'm struggling with the pain of the world. Can you help me with that? So God was the call and response there is, of course we can help you with the struggling. Of course you can help you with the suffering.
Mm.
I want to do my part to create a beautiful world. Can you help me find my way to do that? Can you show me all the signs and symbols? Can you help me feel so clearly when I'm in alignment with my soul? Can you help me hear you and your way for life? Your way for me, your way for life? And then you get to be open and listen. So the thing that prayer isn't is filling in all the details of the story. Right? That's kind of what you do as you live. And it's interesting. I mean, we're all very story-oriented people. It's interesting to look at how I am and am not story-oriented in terms of how I live prayer. Like, or where a story is open or where a story is full in terms of the details. Yeah. Yeah. But there's an interesting aspect about prayer that is, you know, woven in with reality creation, with living the story you want to live for yourself. And particularly in San Pedro, there's a way in which prayer is also that same kind of programming. It's that same kind of like, help me to live, be the person I want to be the person I know myself to be. But often what's lovely about the way that intersects with prayer and medicine work is that I really like being open to see, being open to direct perception of like my own higher self, my own dharmic direction, like dharmic callings in a way where I don't feel like I'm the one making it up. Right? Like, I don't trust that impulse spiritually very deeply, to be really honest. Like when I see people living that way, I'm kind of like, I can't tell if that's spirituality or if that's just narcissism. But when at the core of the story making process is a very deep openness to listen, that's what I trust in a person. It's what I trust in myself.
I really appreciate that, because I feel like, every great storyteller begins as a listener and as a great listener. That's what storytelling is. It's
Yeah.
it's listening and then allowing yourself to be the reporter, reporting in, from the listening side.
Exactly.
And this, I love as you were speaking, you made me think about prayer in a different way. And I just want to acknowledge that, that word probably triggered, some people who have different associations with what that is. And so just honoring that. But what I really heard you saying is like a prayer, it's a call for collaboration. It's saying my ego, just as you said, is not running the show, even though it wants to, and it really wants to sometimes. But
Mm.
it's that moment where like we stop the show, we say, I'm calling for collaboration, and I'm using the power of my words to declare this, not just to myself, not to think it, but to put it into motion.
Yes.
And it's like, yeah, the tongue speaks it, the body does it, and puts it into action. Um, and I just really appreciate that kind of reframing. It's a call for collaboration. I want to collaborate with the universe. Let's go to a space that's not as easy to talk about. You know, which, when I asked you, I was like, what's hot on your mind today? And you're like, polarization. And I'm like, awesome. There's so much polarization happening on the planet right now. There's got to be there's got to be someone here that wants to write them. I hope I didn't freeze in a horrible position.
You didn't.
Okay, good. But I was saying that I was like, somebody should write the story of, if I was to write a story about the time, I would say it was a time of many stories happening at once. Yeah. But there's also another story of which is kind of a thing, because when we really think about how extraordinary this moment is, for most of human time, we lived in our groups of like people, where we grew up with the same origin story. We had the same stories about the land. We had the same stories about what roles we played. We had the same stories about how we were created and what we were here to do. And now all of a sudden we're expected to live on the same block with 30, 40, 50 other stories and walk down the street with them and act like that's normal. I mean, it's kind of like super mind-blowing what we're doing, and as humans, and I always want to be so gentle with us. This is really exceptional what we're doing, but it's not only living at the time of many stories happening together at once. We're no longer in one shared story. We're no longer watching the one news channel, like, I don't know, we grew up, there were 3 news channels. I think they were all saying the same thing,
And
you
they were
know
all saying the same thing.
so it's like now it's like this is the wild west of news and information and consciousness and conscious navigation.
Mhm.
But it's like in that time, wow, now we're in the realm of polarization, and it sounds like you've been thinking a lot about that.
I'm really enjoying listening to you. It is a time of many stories. I mean, what I've been thinking about over the last couple of days is the unresolved stories that cause us to create other. And like, why do we find it so important to generate a scapegoat, an evil one? Why do we find it so natural, even? And I was grappling in the last couple of days with racism and with the construct of, someone who is less than, who is who you can live on top of. And and then also grappling with the complexity of the Middle East, which is extremely complex. And how it's even, I mean, there's so many layers. It's even hard to listen to the many stories. There's some interesting research that there's so many ways we could take this conversation. There's been some interesting, it's contested research, but it's interesting research that we actually can't be empathic with multiple perspectives at the same time.
Hmm.
It's yeah, it's contested research, but it's actually interesting to think about where if how honest can I be about how it is or isn't difficult for me? I think it has to do with worldview, whether you can or can't feel empathy for multiple perspectives at the same time.
I want to talk to that researcher because I feel like as storytellers, just through the story lens, it's
Mm-hmm.
like that's what writers to do. That's what storytellers get to do. That's what actors get to. Well, maybe actors playing one role, but like if a storyteller is worth their grain and salt, I don't know if that's the right phrase or not, but you know what I'm trying to say. Somebody write that phrase trying to capture. Oh, please. But their weight in salt. If their storyteller is worth their weight in salt, then in the story, you should be able to see all these different perspectives happening at once.
Yeah,
Because that's fullness, right?
yeah.
And I think that's what bums me out about some of our newscasters, honestly. And there's some ones that I really respected and appreciated, but their commitment to othering, their commitment to making a bad guy. And it's, the work of William Ury is some of the most inspiring work I know. He came out of Harvard and wrote a book called The Third Way. And he did this work all around conflict resolution and saying, yeah, there's your way and there's your way and there's a third way and where everyone wins. It's a paradigm breaking approach,
Mm-hmm.
and where there's not a loser.
Mm-hmm.
And this piece that you're talking about, where I heard you going around what in us requires us having a scapegoat, which is such a great um scapegoat's such a great role.
Right.
I don't know do we have scapegoats in the room? I'm just curious because I'm going to look around the room because I'm curious. Okay, we've got some scapegoats, right? Okay, we know that, right? It's a powerful role. I've been on both sides of this. I'll just tell you, I've been the scapegoat, so I know what that's like. It's a very high function. It's a very I'm sure there's people here that speak all about the necessity of that. I don't That's not my job in the world, but I do know that it's a powerful role for both people. It's a power play because you're giving power and you're receiving power when you're the scapegoat. It's sort of like the victim role. The victim roles, it's a little sneaky too. You think that the victim is the poor guy, but like sometimes, when we play a victim role, I'm not talking about, I want to be careful here because there's social injustices and there are things that are just I want to make a distinction about when someone is victimized by an outside structure and when someone gets so habituated into playing the victim role, it can be a power play. It's an amazing thing. And as storytellers, we get to see the energetics of where's the energy in the room going. When we scapegoat, you're talking about this polarization, where are we putting the energy? We're not committing the energy to wholeness, which is what your whole point was around polarization, right? We're actually saying, no, let's fracture. I want to hear you talk about that because I know that you've been having so many great thoughts about it. Oh, and Terry's bringing us some etymology. Thank you, Terry. I love this. Worth your salt. It's an idiom.
Yeah.
Good at your job. Something that you're worth. Thank you.
Well, and salt was like currency in the
Yeah.
ancient times. So
Right.
it was very, very precious. Imagine
Right.
food with no salt. It's like quite steady. Um, there's so much, there's so many things swirling in my mind right now, fundamentalism and polarization. And one of the things that led us into this conversation was looking at again at into the ancestral stories, into the unconscious content of stories that cause us to identify in one way or another with a group that has an other.
Mm.
Um, and I think it's comfortable, like in kind of like a liberal progressive space to say, well, I don't have that. And then if we're honest right now, there's like actually there are others. And they look like people putting 10 commandments in Tennessee schools, and they look like there's plenty of of things to explore there in terms of one's own relationship with, like, how am I co-creating that? And without going into kind of like shallow spiritual woo, like, or like shallow Jungians frames of like the dark is always creating the light is already creating the dark. But what, where am I continuing to build on stories that aren't in wholeness around, and where are any of us doing that? Like, are we really aware of the content that we're building our story on top of? Like, you can't build a story of wholeness on top of a bunch of polarization and expect the polarization to go away. It speaks to the third thing. It's like, what is the content that has to be met so that the third thing can actually not only be identified, but actually be embraced?
You're speaking to me like the difference between a lie and true alchemy.
Yes.
Really. And it's we had Nick Bourdain here a couple of weeks ago who was connected to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really incredible to hear him speak about the power of that. But one of the things he said was they did step one. Step one was they listened, they witnessed. People got to be seen and heard in places and ways that they've never been able to before.
Mm-hmm.
But that wasn't enough to heal the story. There was actually another step. There was an action that needed to be taken that wasn't in order to truly heal the story.
Mm-hmm.
So that's and I'm hearing you speak to the distinction between what are the stories that we're stepping on top of or standing on, and how do we bring true healing to those stories?
Yeah. Like in the work I've been doing around placemaking, that has to do with literally sitting with all the stories you're sitting on top of. So, you can't make place by just saying, well, I'm home here and I have a story about this place. And because that's layering, that's been done. And the pendulum keeps swinging around who gets to be home. Right. So if we're really going to make place, then there's a process of unearthing stories, acknowledging, listening, apology. And apology is a really interesting step because sometimes apology asks for pause. In the Jungian frame of the masculine and feminine, there's a Jungian kind of like 4-quadrant frame, and the quiescent frame of the feminine, which is related to yin. Like sometimes you have to hang out there for a while, so things might need composting. Composting is slow. A knife might need to get buried until it's dissolved. And then there's a point of asking permission again to see if the energy is whole enough that forward can happen. I mean, that I don't know a ton. I'd love to hear this man speak about the truth and reconciliation process, because I have spent a fair bit of time in South Africa, and the the rupture of those truth and reconciliation processes was so sad. I mean, the rupture in the ANC, in the African National Congress Party, which was Mandela's party, was also horrific. They got completely bought out. I was in South Africa when Trump won the election in 2016, and everyone around me, white and Black Africans, were like, "Oh, here you go. You're in for it. You're about to go through what we've been through." Like they from that perspective, they saw an unspooling process that they were like, "It's your turn." That's what people are saying.
Isn't that a great bigger picture? In terms of how life works, how culture works, how the planet works, how cycles work,
Yes.
and how speaking of stories and medicine work, it's like I remember I grew up with that idea that I had to save the world, not from like a crazy narcissistic perspective. I'm a Capricorn. Like we're just the tenders of the next 7 generations. Like it's just our gig, And I really believe that like I came in, I had to do something, couldn't rest unless I was part of it. It was like this save the world story. Oops. Sorry, guys. I am on an island in the middle of in the middle of the Pacific, and it's a miracle that we can do this. But anyway, so I came in with a story that I had something to do, and it was like I had a thumb in my back for a good part of my life, and I went in with a big prayer to a medicine story circle, and I received a story. And when I received the story, it was that I saw all these ancient civilizations rising and falling. And I felt it in my body. I felt the rise of Egypt and the fall of Egypt, the rise of Greece and the fall of Greece. And I felt the rise of our country and the fall of our country. And it felt like to me like seasons, like there's just seasons of life. Fall, winter, spring, summer. And it's not about resisting it. It's not about pushing against it. It's not about trying to make summer last forever. It's about how do you live within the season that you're living in. And that completely shifted my approach to life and my approach to my path and my approach to my work. And it was like, how can we live elegantly and gracefully in the season of life? And just hearing this global perspective of like, well, it's like when we do the work in circle, where if you're when you're doing your work, it's like one does their work for all, and we all know that we'll eventually the spokes will turn and we'll all have our moment to do whatever it is. Sometimes we get to live in grace, sometimes we get to live in beauty, sometimes we get to live in suffering, sometimes where that pain, it's like it all goes around, if we're alive and keep going. And so I just appreciate that perspective, like, well, it's your turn now. Have fun. I mean, not that it's funny because it's not, but we're in a big story. No, it's not funny at all. But we're in a big story. We're in a big story that is constantly shifting and changing, and there's seasons. And how do we live within the seasons? And how do we keep our eye on the big story and not get caught in the illusion that this is just one moment? And that the only way that we make it to the next season is if we prepare for it. In summer you prepare for fall, and fall you prepare for winter. Winter you chill out, literally.
Mm-hmm.
Then mud season comes. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting talking about what is underneath the polarity. Like I have a very clear image in my mind. I'll try to explain it right now of there's a process for those of us who are in any way committed to anchoring wholeness. And I think of that as an energetic. I think of that as a third way. I think of that as homing, like holding like this place that I occupy, my body, my heart, my psychoenergetic field, my home, the place that I live physically, ecologically, culturally, is a place I'm seeking to be home in, to make a home for more people to share as home. So for those of us committed to that, there is a process of unearthing, healing, and like restoring. And by restory, I mean to restore and to restory at the same time, or as a convergent process, as a dance. Then at the same time, this other thing is happening, which is I call this the planetary crucible. So the limits of growth, the limits of ecosystem services, climate change, existential tech on like many horizons, nuclear, synth bio, AI, etc., are all kind of pressing on humanity, the 100+ degree heat and billions of people right now, etc., upcoming food shortages, climate migrations. It's all pressing on us. And it's pressing on us universally in a way that is greater than the polarity, because it is a leveling function in some way on us all being one species, universally bound to the biosphere. And one of the reasons I've been sort of like a little obsessed just recently about polarization and the underlying dynamics of scapegoating is because it's obvious to me that unless we navigate that part of the human psyche well, the planetary crucible will, I see a potential in the planetary crucible that that pressure can help us rise into a universal identity of we're one species who is universally bound to this planet. And that story has been told by many, many teachers. It's a perennial story. Barbara Marx Hubbard told it. Teilhard de Chardin told it. Buckminster Fuller told it. Like, it's been told by so many different people, but the crucible wasn't pressing as tightly as it is pressing now. So there's what I think of as a bio-spiritual process happening. Like, the story has just become material reality. It's not a story anymore. It is a story, and it's a non-arbitrary story that's actually a physical process happening.
Well, and I love that you're using the word pressing, because I can't help but think about the birth canal, which
Totally.
it's narrow, it's squeezing, it's uncomfortable. You're
Yeah.
being like you're pushed out of the world that you knew, which I don't know about you guys, but I keep looking at this new world. I'm like, it's not playing by the same rules we've always been playing by. Where are we now? And it's like, and and there's a squeeze, and it's really uncomfortable, and not everybody makes it through.
Right.
It's like it's an initiatory process.
Right.
And I feel like when we have that context and that framework, we can say, okay, well, then how do you birth? How do you birth a new story? How do we leave the old and go into the new? I love that you kept saying we have to restory, we have to return. It's like we can't ignore where we came from. There's got to be some alchemy. We've got to bring it with us so we get the power of our story. And that's where I love when we tell those really painful, sucky experiences of our lives, and we I don't want to use the word mind them, because look, that's extractive language. When we harvest, when we receive the gift, the fruit of our labor, and we get the power from that experience of whatever painful suffering experience, now we've got like our life force power. Same thing what you're talking about, this restoring. It's like if we're not bringing the power from where we came from with us into the new place, we're not carrying the wisdom, the insight, the knowledge, the remembering of why we want to do it in another way. I love that this piece of one species, it's like it's a whole different story when we're all in
Yeah.
it together.
Yeah. The custodial story, the story, and the word restory comes from Brock Dolman, who is the water
Mhm.
genius, permaculturalist, beaver wilder of Northern California. And um, what's beautiful about the way he uses that word is it's both a restorying in terms of narrative, and it's a storiation that is something we do with our bodies, which points to like the word I used earlier, non-arbitrary, that there's a way in which, it's like you shall know them through their acts. There's the way I think of this process we're in is that the way we get to act has to be regenerative. It has to be healing and holding, and that's how we will know each other in the process,
Mhm.
through how we are being the ones who's or in the Buddhist frame, it all comes down to conduct. It's like there's practice, but conduct. And that will be kind of like the fun that we get to live on that horizon as we navigate the many stories, that the invitation is to um, take care of our land, take care of our neighbors, take care of our food and watersheds and each other. Um, and that may become harder, but that behavioral ground that grounds in human and more than human relationships will become more and more obvious.
That is a beautiful way for us to close. I can't believe I just looked up at the clock and I was like, oh my God, we've been here for an hour. Didn't, didn't even feel like that. It was like a blink of an eye.
Yeah.
If there's any pressing questions that are among us, then please feel free to put them in the chat. Um, Samantha is going to be teaching one of the classes in the upcoming course, The Alchemy of Story. And we've got this course called Returning to the Bones. And it's really about discovering your essence, how to tell your essence story, your mythology story, your personal mythology. But first, we're going to learn origin stories and we're going to learn those foundational lineage stories. So we have to understand where we come from, both from a land-based understanding from those origin stories and both from a culture space of understanding from our lineage stories. And then we'll get into the magic of the mythos of telling our story. So it's a really fun course. I'm going to stay on for anyone who wants to know a little bit more about the Alchemy of Story, which is both a certification program for those who want to help others really work with story as a tool for powerful shifting and change, transformation, healing, and fun. And I love it because some people have been saying they're like, Leah, someone's actually said they fired their therapist, and I was like, well, it's not therapy. This is not what we're doing, but it sure is therapeutic and it sure is fun. And I've seen it make some of the greatest changes in my own life and in the life of people who get to come through. So if you're looking for one of those amazing tools to add to your toolbox, I'll stay on for a little bit. Otherwise, Samantha, what are things that, you just opened up this beautiful world. I'm really excited that you'll be coming and teaching a class and people get to go through some of these practices and techniques and learn how to really apply it into their lives. And then also, are there ways that people can stay in touch with you?
People can find me at my website, which is samanthasweetwater.com. There's an ebook there that shares the story, a part of the story of my upcoming book called True Human. And specifically, it's the story from Sophia, who is a teacher from another planet where they transcended technological adolescence without breaking life. And yeah, and I'm on IG at Samantha Sweetwater and Facebook and LinkedIn. So those are the places I can be found.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to turn off our recording. And dun, dun, dun.